This will be the summary presentation for Chapter 12. This is our last chapter that we will cover in this class. Chapter 12 is dealing with the types of communication that will occur during the life of the project. So this will give some insights into what makes good and poor communication, the different nature of communication that will need to happen, and how to select the proper form of communication for each particular task. We will begin by overviewing at a very high level the different big items within the communication frontier. There are really two modes of disseminating information and then receiving the information. For the delivery of information, we have speaking and writing. These have very different purposes. Okay, speaking really needs to be reserved for situations where two-way communication, a discussion, a Q&A is required. That's where speaking, oral communication shines. If you're simply wanting to deliver information one way, one directional, then written communication is often best because it's less ambiguous. Now, oral communication or speaking also adds nuance to the overall communication process because body language, tone, your presentation of yourself during the communication communicates also. So the exact same words can be used, but the tone of how they're presented or the way in which you handle yourself during the presentation can deliver a very, very different meaning. So therefore, you need to be fully engaged in oral communication. Oral communication is a significant investment of energy because everything you do during that oral communication is impacting the message that's being delivered. Written communication is a bit different. Written communication tends to be one-dimensional because you're delivering information, and you have an opportunity for review and edit before it goes out the door, so to speak. So this allows you to have much greater control of what happens within written communication. Now, written communication can take many different forms. We have small communications, things like memos and letters, all the way up to full reports. So what will be necessary for each task may vary, but in general, written communication tends to allow more formal documentation of ideas. Written communication can also be a good way to follow up on oral communication. So for instance, when a meeting is held and discussions are had, then written communication can be used to follow up on what was really discussed to make sure that everyone has the same understanding. Perhaps a follow-up to a phone call, something like that. The goal of written communication, though, is to inform. That's the primary goal. Confirm as well, but primarily inform. The goal of oral communication is to discuss. It's that two-way narrative. Now, listening is also critical in this entire process. This is how information is received. It's obviously a big part of oral communication because if discussion is truly happening, then you're going back and forth between the role of the speaker and the listener. Listening has less to do with the written format. Listening is not something that automatically occurs. You have to invest energy into actually listening. You need to fully engage in the act of listening. You've heard the cliche phrase, active listener, okay? That's a person that actually invests energy into the listening process to truly understand what is being said, and then afterwards, through the process of questioning, to reach a conclusion. One of the real critical features of being a good listener is to avoid bias and avoid jumping to conclusions. We tend to hear what we want to hear, and that is a dangerous thing. We need to listen and hear what's actually being said, and only much later after we have confirmed and questioned, reach a conclusion. Much of oral communication within the project setting will occur within meetings. Meetings can be a horrible thing, in my opinion. Meetings can waste tremendous amounts of time. In fact, I have a coffee mug sitting on my desk right at this moment as I record this brief summary that says, "I survived another meeting that should have been an email." Meetings should not always be used. If you look here on the on the left-hand side, before you have a meeting, the first thing to do is decide if a meeting is even really necessary. Because a meeting is costly. You're engaging the time of multiple people, sometimes 5, 6, 7, 8 people may be called to a meeting. And if that meeting lasts an hour, you just used 8 hours of skilled labor in that meeting. The question is did you get 8 hours of value out of that meeting? So once you've determined if a meeting is really necessary, then move on and determine the purpose of the meeting, who needs to be at the meeting, and clearly set an agenda for the meeting so that time can be used efficiently and productively. That may require that you prepare materials in advance. The worst thing you can do is just invite people to a meeting without telling them what's going on or what it's about, and then they come ill-prepared, and the meeting will tend to not produce significant results. On the day of the meeting, when that time comes, start on time, end on time, and have someone taking notes. Probably best if that's not you. A designated note taker, you will be running the meeting, you will be trying to keep things moving and staying on track with what needs to be discussed. If you're taking notes at the same time, it's distracting. Once the meeting is finished, you need to then follow up with written communication, typically within 24 hours or so. The reason for this is we all at times are ineffective as listeners. So in a meeting, discussion is happening, but that doesn't mean everybody heard the same thing. People can sometimes zone out for a bit, they can become distracted, they might miss something that is said, and therefore you need to have published meeting minutes, published meeting notes that will communicate in a very concise way what was discussed and what was decided in that meeting so that everybody remains aligned. On the right-hand side of the slide is a small insert from your book that gives some very meaningful things that you should always think about during meetings. I like a few of these. I will not go through all of these, but you need to avoid speaking over people. So one person speaks at a time. Everybody at the meeting should be important enough that you want to hear what they say. If they're not important enough that you need to hear what they say, they shouldn't have been invited to the meeting. That's the bottom line. Now, it's best, sure, sometimes humor can help. Sometimes, some levity can make the meeting feel a little bit more upbeat, but try to remain on track, stick to the topic at hand, and avoid sarcastic or cynical remarks, okay? Those things can just destroy the meeting, and if you can stay on focus, stay on task, you'll get the meeting done quicker and let everybody get back to work. Now, the other thing that I would encourage you to always keep in mind is that meetings have a tendency to devolve into just a bantering session where people are complaining about what's going on, why did this happen, who has dropped the ball, blah, blah, blah. Try to avoid gossip, try to avoid criticism. Focus on the problem. Deal with what needs to be discussed and get to solutions. Don't let the meeting just become a rant session. Now, turning our attention a little bit to written materials, progress reports are likely going to be one of the key written documents that you will have during the life of a project. Project reports are critical in some fields. In my field of engineering, progress reports are absolutely critical. They're typically required on a very frequent basis. Weekly basis is very typical of a project team and each sub-portion of the team. What a progress report does is it allows the project manager to understand what is actually getting done, and it allows the project manager to communicate to their supervisors what is actually getting done. A progress report, though, is not an activity report. Being busy does not mean that you're actually getting anything done. The progress report is supposed to document progress, not just work. So these are the things you need to focus on. What has actually been accomplished since the prior report? You don't need to review and rehash everything that's been in earlier reports. What has actually been accomplished? Not just talked about, not just thought about, but actually accomplished. You would likely want to summarize the current status of project performance. What percent are you at? Have we reached 75% completion? Are we 75% to the quality that we need and we're still working on fixing the issues? What's going on? So what is the actual project performance? This could include financial as well, depending upon how frequently financial tracking is going to be included in this cycle. Any problems or potential problems need to be documented, but I would like to warn you that these need to be actual problems. So it is not a problem to say, well, we're running behind on this. Okay, so you're running behind on a particular project or a particular task. That needs to be addressed, but that's not a problem that your manager needs to help you address necessarily. That's just you're running behind. That happens on every program. And so therefore, you as the project manager or the sub lead on that task of the project need to address that, but it doesn't necessarily need to be reported up to the person above you. What is being talked about here when you say problem or potential problem is something that is somewhat out of your control that could impact the project. So for instance, we need to buy a significant amount of steel for this particular activity, and we've learned from the supplier that they can't provide it. There's a shortage of steel right at this point in time, or the price is quadrupled on steel, and we now have a significant limitation on our supply chain. That is something that your supervisor likely needs to get involved on because it may be above what you can address yourself. If you've had problems on past reports, so if you've reported problems or potential problems from the past, then state what has been done to resolve those problems. If you haven't reported past ones, then you wouldn't need to report progress, but it's a good idea to report what has been done to address those. Any planned corrective actions, so changes that might need to go into the baseline plan, things that need to be communicated to the person above you in order to make sure that the planning stays true. And then what do you anticipate having done by the next reporting period? So what is the milestone? This obviously then factors into the next report as to what have you really accomplished. You'll notice that this is focusing on actually what has been done and what is preventing you from getting stuff done. It's not about who did what. It's not about how many hours did they spend. It's not about, complaints within the team. This is about actual progress on the project. Now, the final report, as presented in the textbook, tends to be a summary of the overall project. Now, final reports will vary a little bit from discipline to discipline. For instance, in an engineering setting, the final report will typically also include detailed design documents, perhaps detailed analysis files, in order to justify the design work. But that would be very exclusive to an engineering type project. A computer science type project or a software oriented project, I would anticipate would have software testing portions in the final report to demonstrate the functionality of the software and those types of features that are exclusive to that discipline. What it is not, however, it is not simply an accumulation of the past progress reports. So you don't simply, well, this week we did this week we did this week we did this, and call that a final report. The final report needs to be written separate from the progress reports and needs to tell the story of the project at a summary level. Typically, as stated again in the book, this will vary a little bit from discipline to discipline, they're saying it typically does not include a lot of detail, but instead serves more as a summary, and then there may be in the appendix or in other subsequent files the detailed design work. That will again vary somewhat. So, items that the final report may include: the original customer needs and how well the project met those needs, okay? Actual versus anticipated benefits of the project. So these were the things the project was going to accomplish for the customer, or these were the strengths that you presented for your approach to the project. Did those actually pan out? Or maybe even they're better than what you had originally thought. Brief description of the project, enough detail to explain what was accomplished. If future work needs to be done, or future consideration, or future testing, or upgrades, it's a good idea to list those in the final report so that it's documented. This is somewhat to protect you. This way you have informed the customer and you have informed your upper management that these things were considered and were identified as being important, but the current budget and the current scope doesn't allow them. But you have expressed and documented the fact that they were identified so that you have that record. A list of all deliverables that are going to be going to the customer, so what is actually being turned over to the customer, and then data. It could be material test data, performance test data, software, validation data, you name it, all types of data. If the data was taken, the customer is going to want that data in order to be able to learn from it for future projects, so it needs to be included, typically in an appendix, not in the main body of the report. Now, just a few items that will help make your reports better. Learning to write a good report takes time, takes skill. It's a skill that you develop during your entire career, and I certainly do not consider myself an expert writer yet. I've gotten better, but I have a long ways to go, and we can always improve our writing. But here's some good general guidelines that the book discusses. First of all, be concise. There is nothing impressive about a long, wordy report that could have been accomplished in half the pages and said just as much. Good writing is concise writing. These are work reports, technical reports, official reports. These are not fictional novels. And so wordiness is not something to be praised. It's actually very bad. So be concise. Write in a way similar to how you would speak. This has changed some over the years. In my field of engineering and in many technical fields, it used to be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, everything was written in third person passive. Now things are more in first person active voice, or at very least active voice, even if it's not first person. So more conversational kind of speaking. So as an example, you might say, the team tested the apparatus to failure and found the load at failure is da-da-da, okay? Where in the old world you might say, the apparatus was tested to failure using situations, da-da-da, but you never talk about just the team. You never use pronouns or nouns in a third person environment. Instead, it's not important in a third person environment who did the work. That tends to be rather formal and non-conversational. It makes the report easier to read if you are conversational in your writing. So write as you would speak. Put most important points first. Now, this can be a little, I can argue with this one a little bit. The book will discuss it, so read what the book says. Often you will want to document things in a structured way, and that means important stuff is going to appear throughout the report. What I might modify this to say is put important stuff in the executive summary. Most formal reports are going to begin with an executive summary or abstract. This will be a one-page, at most, often only a half a page, summary of what the report accomplishes. Many managers will read that page and then toss the report. They are busy people. They have lots of demands on their time. They're not going to read the entire report. No matter how good your report is, they're not going to read your entire report. They're going to read the summary and assume the summary told them everything they really needed to know, which means the important aspects, the important learnings, not the details, but the important learnings and features of your report need to be in that executive summary. Number 4, use graphics where possible. I am a huge advocate of visual learning. Rather than include 15 data tables, include a graph. Instead of spending 4 paragraphs trying to explain a test setup, take a photograph of it and include the photograph with maybe some pointers to key features. Use graphics because, as the cliche says, a picture's worth 1,000 words. We want to keep our reports concise, and pictures, graphics can help tremendously in this area. Finally, keep the format of the report clean. Don't get fancy. Simple format is typically the best. Just find a clean, structured format. Headers and subheadings are useful because they help guide the reader, but not too many levels. Don't have 5, 6 nested levels of headings. That becomes confusing. Keep just a simple structure. Finally, before we close out this summary, you need to control how communication flows, especially written communication within your project. A lot of written communication will happen within the course of a project, especially a longer project, 8, 9 months. A lot of documents are going to be written. Progress reports, memos, letters, final reports, things like that. Not everyone needs to receive every report. In fact, it overwhelms people if they receive every report. The inclination on a team is to assume that if I receive the report, I'm somehow supposed to read it and know about it. Well, if they don't need to know that information, it just bogs them down to receive it. So the book presents a communication control table as a tool to help with this. So what document is being discussed? Who is creating the document? How frequently is this required? So like progress reports, are these going to be required weekly, monthly, you name it? Who will receive copies of this document? Who needs to receive copies of this document? Are there any actions required? And they use a little key here, I, C, or A. I means it's for information only. C is they need to review and comment on what was discussed. A is they need to actually review and approve it. You're actually expecting an approval response back on what that document states. And then any other types of comments necessary. This is a very simple tool, but I think it's a great map to help control the flow of reports, especially in large teams on long projects. Okay. Make sure you read through Chapter 12. There's a lot more detail in there than what I hit in this presentation, but this gives you a bit of a map as to what will be discussed.